Good afternoon and welcome to our talk today. You are here to hear Brad Barth, the Chief Product Officer for InEight, talk about how to never miss an indirect again. We've more broadly titled it Accurately Estimating Indirect and Overhead Costs. The lines are muted on today's call, but if you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to type that into the question box, and we'll leave some time at the end for Brad to address anything that you might want clarified from today's talk. Brad works for us to oversee the entire product strategy and product management team within InEight. So all of the portfolio is his, and he is equally adept at talking about everything across our portfolio, but I think he still has a sweet spot for our estimating products. So in his day job, Brad is responsible for the entire product roadmap and defining the company's next generation solutions. He also has responsibility for our industry advisory group and is our liaison to many of the industry associations that we are involved with at InEight. So without further ado, Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. Great to be here with everybody. I'll add to Carolyn's intro there. I definitely have a sweet spot for the estimating products, and going back to early 90s when it was called Hard Dollar, and when we got that product out into the market, one of the first computerized estimating systems out on the market, and certainly still the primary product for InEight as we've continued to grow and build out the portfolio around it. But it all starts with estimating. It all started with estimating for us as a company, and it often starts in estimating for the projects that you all are involved in. So love to talk about the estimating topic anytime we get the chance. So for the next hour or so, we're going to go through a specific aspect of estimating, and that's around indirect costs. And we're going to really focus on, how do you make sure that you're accurately modeling your indirect costs? One of the things that's interesting about my role and also all of us on the team here at InEight get the chance to see a lot of estimates, right? So as we're working with customers and prospective customers, and trying to find is there a good fit between our software and what the customer is trying to do, we often get exposed to the estimates that customers are putting together today. So we have pretty unique perspective. I mean, literally thousands of customer estimates we've had the chance to take a look at over the many years. So we see probably just about everything, as you can imagine, as we look at the different ways estimates are put together. Question on the screen here is probably a facetious question a little bit here, right? Why do we care about indirect costs? I imagine everybody on the phone today knows why we care about indirect costs, but really what we're going to focus on is how do we make sure that we are adequately covering our indirect costs with the right level of precision and really doing that thing that estimators are kind of challenged to do, which is capture the assumptions, validate those assumptions, and build precision as you go through the estimating process as those knowns or unknowns become knowns, and you continue to refine the estimate. So maybe we can start with, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. Again, I think everybody probably on the call has a good feeling for what indirect costs are, but this is a definition that I like to use. So costs that are not directly related to specific scope of work, but are required for completion of the project. So it's those things that are not. You could take some scope or some pay items or certain line items out of the estimate, and those indirects would still be there. They may change, but the need for them is still there. And we'll talk more specifically about what some of those things are as we go through the presentation here. So when we look at directs along with other types of costs and fees in a typical project, we often represent it as a pyramid, just because the directs you see there on the bottom are often the the foundation on which all the other stuff sits. And typically, the lower sections of that pyramid are the biggest ones. So it makes sense to look at it that way. So as we look at, from a contractor's perspective, directs, indirects, and profit are typically what we're focused on. The owner is going to have some additional costs. As we think about it, working from the bottom up, direct costs, things like craft labor, materials, equipment, costs related to subs. Then we get into those indirects, things like supervision, job equipment, small tools, maybe temporary work, temporary access roads, temporary utilities, things like that. Certainly profit fees, I think everybody understands what that means. And then, like I said, if you're on the owner side, you might have some other ancillary costs, land acquisition, regulatory fees, maybe some finance costs, things like that. So we're gonna focus on that brown section there, the indirects. That's really our topic here for today. And this is, like I said, we get the chance to review a whole bunch of estimates, and these are broad ranges, but typically this is what we see on most of the projects, which could be everything from a stadium to a power plant to a bridge, right? Directs typically 50 to 80% of the project, indirects 15 to 30%, profit 5 to 15%. And there's always cases outside of those ranges, right? But that's generally what we see out there. So the importance of our indirect costs, and let's make sure that we're talking about indirects the same way. And one of the things that we find a lot is, there's folks that really spend a great deal of time and energy on their direct costs and do a great job going out to, the fifth decimal place and never round anything because we want to get extremely precise in our direct costs. But then sometimes you'll get into the indirects and you'll see, oh, well, here's a line item for $2 million. Well, where did that come from? And turns out it's, well, it's just 5% on top of, all of our costs or something along those lines, right? Where there's really not a model behind that number on the indirects, which leads to problems in precision and accuracy that makes it hard to go through that process that I just said in terms of let's list the assumptions, let's validate them, and then let's refine them the next time we have an opportunity. So, modeling our indirects is going to be really important. The other thing is we run into quite a bit is the blurring of the lines between indirects and profit. You'd be surprised at how many situations we run into where it's kind of direct costs and then everything else, is in a separate bucket, and what ends up being indirects versus profit is never really delineated, neither in the estimate nor in the as-built. So we think it's really important to isolate those indirects from the profit. Obviously, that profit, we want to stick to the strictest definition there, which is really the reward for taking on the work. So it's not a cost, right? That's a return for our investment of resources, time, and otherwise. So we want to make sure that we're isolating directs, indirects, and profit. And then risk in those indirects, right? If we just have a big round number in there for our indirects, it's very hard to understand the impacts as things change in the project, either during pre-construction or execution. We might have changes in scope, changes in schedules, changes in conditions, all of those things that could impact our indirect costs. And as we saw on that pyramid, if our indirect costs are, let's say 15% of the job, even if they're only 10% of the job, right? That if we get those wrong, that can have a big impact on our profit, right? What's left for profit. The last one here is benchmarking, right? We want to be able to really isolate the direct costs from the indirects so we can get to that repeatable scope. Right? We want to be able to create reusable scope, even though every project is different. We can all relate to that. There are certain aspects of every project that are repeatable, right? So we want to be able to get those directs modeled down to a granular enough level that we can reuse them from job to job, regardless of what job it was. So part of that is to make sure we pull out any indirects from those repeatable models. Let's talk about the types of indirect costs. Pretty simple here. We typically look at this in terms of indirect costs and variable indirect costs. So fixed are obviously, you're not going to see those vary a whole lot regardless of kind of the nature of the project or the scope or the schedule, whereas variable indirects are going to fluctuate based on, they're going to be dependent on different factors. This graphic that you're seeing here is a study that was done by CII, Construction Industry Institute, a few years back. And the nice thing about it is it surveyed both owners and contractors, and these are the things that came up to the top of the list in terms of IDCC, which was indirect construction costs. So, these are things we can all relate to, and these are great, typical examples of indirects that we need to be worried about on a project. So just slotting some of these into those two buckets on the left, great examples of some fixed indirect costs would be like maybe temporary roads and parking, right? If we've got to clear a road, an access road out to the job site, that's probably a fixed cost. Once we understand what that cost is, that's probably not going to change no matter what work we do at the job site, creating that road and maybe a parking area for employees, probably not going to change a whole lot as the project evolves. Utilities, right? If we've got to run utilities out there for electrical or water, same situation there, right? There's most likely a fixed cost to that. Whereas those biggest ones there on the left, and this is what makes it even more important to model these things, they are variable, right? Our field supervision, our major equipment, project management staff, those resources, if you will, are going to vary based on a lot of factors, right? How long is the project going to take? What scope of work is involved? As those things go up or down, so do those indirects. So this is where technology can really be your friend. We've all created Excel spreadsheets, and probably very elaborate Excel spreadsheets with formulas as long as your arms and macros, and we see some amazing spreadsheets that have been created to try to model those indirect costs and capture the assumptions, which is exactly what you want to see. The nice thing about today's technology world is that there's way easier approaches than using Excel to do that. And so we'll kind of, as we go through some of these philosophies and approaches to dealing with indirects, we'll use the InEight estimate tool as kind of a backdrop to look at how the technology can really help you get a handle on these things, especially the variable ones, right, where they change based on job conditions. So when we're estimating our indirects, key considerations that we want to take into account, and this is really true, that first objective there is true of estimating in general, right? We want to create a true cost model. We don't just want a line item that says $2 million. We've got to be able to defend that estimate. It's got to be communicated to all of the folks downstream and all the work processes that happen after estimating, things like work planning, field execution, even accounting, cost accounting, everything that happens after estimating, right? Ideally, the estimating process has captured those assumptions that drive that winning estimate, and then we continue to validate those as the project moves along, and we continue to update our estimate in the form of a forecast, right? So that forecast is not just going to be updating our direct costs, but ideally we should be updating the forecast of our indirects as well. To do that, we need a true cost model of those things, right? We need to understand what are the driving factors that affect those indirects. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit already, but typical drivers of our indirects: the scope of the project, the duration of the project, the overall value of the project. So there's one typical, even a bond cost, right? As the value or the price of the project goes up or down, that bond cost might change that we want to account for. And certainly project risks and unknowns, as we put contingencies in or allowances into the estimate to cover those risks. As some of those risks get mitigated, we want to adjust those indirects. So those aren't all of them, not a comprehensive list, but those are the primary drivers of indirect cost. So let's go through a few examples here, and like I said, we'll use the InEight estimate tool as kind of the backdrop to show how some of these approaches could be handled in a software solution like InEight's. First one is field supervision costs. So as we saw on that chart from the CII survey, this was the number one most common indirect cost in a construction project. Right. So these are the count and duration of project managers, project engineers, really that project level personnel that are going to be working across the project. Right. If it's direct labor, our carpenters, our welders, our concrete finishers, right, those are going to be tied up in our direct costs, whereas project managers, project engineers, field engineers, superintendents, those are typically handled as indirect costs. So here's an example of what that might look like. So here in the InEight estimate tool, we've got we'll show a few different examples as we go through this. This job's more of a building job, vertical building job. And you can see, as is often the case, this is kind of organized around our divisions, right? So our CSI divisions are guiding the structure here in this case. And over in the right there, you can see from the red lines down, the red and green ones, those are all of our direct line items in this estimate. And then up above that, we can see kind of these above the line indirects. Pretty typical approach. Different folks have different takes on how do we, should we isolate those indirects kind of above the line? Should we put them down inside the body of the estimate? We'll talk, time permitting, we'll talk about how we allocate indirects like we're showing here. Even if we've isolated them towards the top of the estimate, we might want to allocate them back down into the main sections of the estimate. Personally, I like, as we're kind of putting the estimate together, we can keep these separate and all above the line here. They're easy to spot and easy to find. So that supervision one, like we talked about so far, we want to have not just a big number there. In this case, $2.5 million, 35,000 man hours. Well, how did we get to that number? And this is where we want to capture that detail, right? So if I expand that, again, whether you're using an Excel spreadsheet or a tool like InEight estimate, we want to be able, this is the kind of detail we want to be able to capture, right? What types of supervision personnel are we going to need on this particular project? So those are the types of them there, 1 through 10. And then how many of them do we need and for how long, right? So, and that's a pretty light level of detail, but that would be, I would say, a minimum that we would want to capture. This is an area, like I said, where a lot of times this is, sometimes we'll see this is, all of this detail is really just a percent. Let's add 5% or 10% or whatever the number is on top of our direct costs, where we want to obviously be, if we're going to be able to have a validated model that we can validate through reality, we want to be able to list all these assumptions, right? And that's all they are going into the estimating process, is just assumptions. An estimating tool is going to make it easy to have, unit costs in a database for these different resources. So as long as somebody's, in the company is keeping those rates current, then all we've got to worry about as an estimator is, like I said, how many of them do we need to handle the work, and then how long are we going to need them? So if let's drill into that in a little more detail. A tool like InEight estimate gives you the ability to define, that same list of 10 resources. We might want to approach them differently. You can see some of them are listed as duration driven, right? Some of them are listed as quantity driven. So this is a great way, again, to create a defensible model where if somebody asks, how did you come up with those numbers? We can say, look, we're assuming all of these resources, the first 7 are tied to the duration of the project. We need them for some or all of the duration of the project. And that red pyramid over there on the right is telling us how long the project is currently expected to take, 60 days, right? And there's a lot more detail we could drill down into. Maybe some of those resources are only needed for half the job and others are needed for the other half. So you can get a lot more detail. The ones, on the other hand, that are marked as quantity driven may not be a function of the duration, but maybe more a function of the overall quantity of work or the scope of work that we're faced with on the project. So different ways to model those indirects. The other thing that you can do is, and this is something we see quite often, is maybe it's not enough to know that we're going to need so many hours of a project manager or so many of them, but we might want to be able to link these to an Excel spreadsheet where we could get into more detail around, like you see in this example. Let's look at it by month, right? So if this is a 10-month project, you often have kind of a ramp up of resources, and then you kind of get to full peak, and then maybe a ramp down towards the end. So there's a view like this inside the InEight estimate tool itself, where you can look at how many do we need per month, or week, or per year if it's a really long project. Or you can, if you've got your favorite Excel spreadsheet already to set up to do this kind of stuff, then you can just come in here and put in these quantities per month, and those come right back into the InEight estimate tool. And that's the goal, right? We want to be able to capture all of this detail so that we can drill down to that level of detail in order to communicate what was the estimate based on, right? We had so many project managers per month, so many superintendents per month. And then that way, as the project moves along and we track as-built, we can understand whether our assumptions were correct or need an adjustment. Let's take a second example. So indirects that are dependent on the project duration. So we want to be able to model those site-related indirects, such as job trailers, fencing, utilities is another example, right, that we're going to be paying for either a rental fee or a cost that's going to be recurring for as long as the project is going on. So here's a different example. This job is more of a heavy highway type job where we've got a list of, you see this one's organized more by kind of pay items, owner pay items over on the left, not so much around CSI divisions. And in this case, just to mix it up a little bit, here we've got some indirects, and we've put them down in the estimate itself just to show you, there are different ways using the InEight estimate tool to handle this stuff. Rather than having it up at the top, you can have this stuff down in the body of the estimate. Now this, you can see these items here: setting up a yard, trailer rental, utilities. That yard setup is listed as a lump sum, right? That one's not. That would be one of those fixed indirects like we talked about at the beginning. Whereas trailer rent, utilities, those things are listed by the month. We've presumably got our rental or cost from the utility in there on a unit basis. That times the quantity that we need gives us that total cost we see on the far right. So, in that case, these are things we often see set up as checklists. Ideally, you've got in your estimate template, again, whether it's an Excel or a tool like an InEight estimate, which does make it a lot easier to handle things like this with templates and with the database. You might have a checklist of, certainly we've seen, indirect costs, line items in the hundreds that you just go down the list, right, and just say, we need this, we don't need that, we need this, we don't need that. And then it's just a matter of how long do we need those things. That unit cost that I referenced just a second ago can be in a database, right? So as we pull those resources into our indirect section of the estimate, that unit cost comes along with it. And then all we've got to do is indicate how long do we need those things. Those unit costs, and again, this is the importance of listing the assumptions so that we can validate them as we go along, right? As we track our actual costs, we should be able to understand how much did we spend renting that trailer, how much did we spend on our utilities at the job site, and start to look at, understand how that will affect future jobs and update our templates in our database. On the duration side, how long do we need these things? We can go one step further, and rather than just entering in those, in this case, months that we need, we can actually tie the estimate to a schedule. right? So if you've created, even if it's a high-level schedule in Microsoft Project or Primavera, you can create that nice schedule, and even inside of Hard Dollar, we have some very simple scheduling capabilities to create relationships. We also have InEight Basis. It also does a great job of allowing you to create schedules with dependencies between the items. But regardless of how you created that schedule, what you can do here and what we're showing in this example is let's tie the estimate to that schedule, right? So that all we've got to do, if that schedule has changed, maybe we've built in some holidays into that schedule, some work days, non-work days. We've set up the sequence of the work in the schedule, and that tells us, maybe it's a 10-month job instead of an 8 or 9 month job. All we've got to do is click that button to update the estimate, and these durations for these resources are going to change automatically. Right? And that's the beauty of a tool like InEight Estimate, where you can tie the cost and the schedule together so that if that schedule changes in any way and the overall duration of the project gets longer or shorter, your costs, especially your indirects here, can go up or down accordingly based on whatever that schedule is telling us the overall duration is. And that can go, we're kind of the example we're looking at here is sort of at a high level. With these things might be tied to the overall duration of the project, but you might have some other indirects that are tied to just maybe specific sections of the schedule or just certain time periods of the schedule. Maybe we need some indirects for the first few months of the project, and then we don't need them again until the last few months of the project. We might have some indirects that we need for as long as the concrete work is going on. Right, so those dependencies can be, again, those relationships can be set up between your indirects and your schedule. And yeah, it takes a little bit of setup work at first, but if your projects are like many where they change constantly as you get up to execution or even after execution, getting those cost and schedule models set up can pay huge dividends down the road as we make changes and not have to worry about keeping our estimate in sync with the schedule. Third example, add-ons and allowances. So we want to be able to model those things like small tools and supplies, perfect examples where we're not going to go and figure out, it's probably extreme to go down and let's figure out how many hammers we need, how long are they going to be needed, how many drills do we need, how long are they going to be needed. All of that kind of small tools, even down to gloves and that kind of stuff, right? Hard hats, all of that stuff, it's perfectly acceptable to think of those things as a percentage, especially if you're doing a good job in cost accounting and tracking what those costs typically are as a percentage. But we can still model them and make some assumptions into those. Let's take a look. So here's back to that vertical building job. Again, back to, in this example, we've got our indirects up at the top of the estimate. We've got a line item in here for direct cost add-ons, which is coming to about $73,000. So let's drill in and see, how did the estimator model those costs? Where did that number come from? If I open up that line item, you can see that $73,000 is coming from two line items, sub-line items, if you will, small tools and supplies and material handling, right? So the two of those together are giving us that $73,000. The small tools and supplies, and this is where, again, you can get more precise than just putting a number on top of your costs. Here we can say, let's make those costs dependent on our labor costs, right? If we're going to look at small tools and supplies, those things are probably a function of how much labor we've got going on, right? How many people are running around the job site that need those small tools and supplies. So perfectly acceptable way to do that. Let's take our labor costs, add some percentage of that, and that gives us that, in this case, $28,000. But again, the beauty of this is we've created that link now and that dependency. So as scope comes out of the estimate, scope goes into the estimate. Our labor costs are going to go up or down. and therefore our indirect costs are going to go up or down automatically as well, right? We'll just always add 5% on whatever that labor cost ends up being. Material handling, similar example here, right? But we're saying in this case it's a percentage, 2.5% on top of our materials. Okay, this is a great example where we might want to get more specific though, and we could have got more specific on our labor, small tools and supplies, certain types of laborers or certain types of labor work might require more in the area of small tools and supplies than others. So we could have done what I'm about to do for materials. We could have done the same thing on our small tools and supplies for labor. But let me show you what I mean here. So I could, rather than just saying, let's take 2.5% on top of all of our materials, let's get more specific about that and define some more dependency. So in this case, what we're saying is that dependency, show me all the line items in the estimate, and I want to go in and define, for the material handling, I'm really worried about our water and sewer work. All the line items that are in that water and sewer section, we got a lot of components, a lot of pipe spools, a lot of flanges and tees and fittings and everything else. We're going to be doing a lot more material handling on that stuff than perhaps on some of our, maybe on our roadway work where it's primarily asphalt aggregate, where our folks aren't moving that stuff around. So here we can just say, let's take that, let's make sure that add-on for material handling is only on material costs, only in the water and sewer section. Okay, and that gives us a much smaller indirect there. And again, as our in this case, as our scope goes up in that water and sewer section, we have more material costs. That 2.5% is going to get added on to the right number. Number 4 here, fourth example, let's talk about contingencies and other types of indirects. Escalation is another great example, right? Any of y'all that do multi-year projects, escalation, I'm sure, is something front of mind in terms of, what our costs going to be like 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and how do we model that? Let's use that escalation as an example. So I mentioned, tying the estimate to a schedule. One of the nice benefits to doing that is that you can look at what are our costs, what does that footprint or cost curve look like over time? You can see on this project, which is about a 5-year project, we got a lot of costs in the second half of the project. So how do we account for that, right? Certainly, we may not know exactly what our costs are going to be in year 5 versus today, but it's probably a safe bet that they're going to be different. And we can use history, we can use economic indicators to make our assumptions. And again, as we proceed through the project, we can update those assumptions as long as we've created a good model. So, here in this heavy highway job, we've got an escalation line item in there, and it's a big one in this case, right? $10 million. So let's take a look at how did we come up with that number. If I double click on that, open it up, what we've done in this case, or what the estimator has done, is for that $10 million of escalation, let's see how that was arrived. We set up 5 different line items in here. And we did it really just by year, right? So there's flexibility in the InEight estimate tool to define these date ranges. You might have seasonal costs. We want to maybe escalate some costs during the winter seasons, or some additional water costs or other PPE type costs for either winter or summer. Those types of things can be managed through these date ranges. But here, a simple example, we've just said, let's do it beginning of the year to the end of the year. And by putting each year in there, then we can go in and define over on the right what percentage add-ons we want and on top of what types of costs, right? I'm giving you a real simple example here, but your imagination can go the rest of the way. If we look in the year 2023, what it's showing me here is based on the schedule. Remember, we've tied the estimate to the schedule. It knows how much cost we have in the year 2023. In the red circle there, I can go in and say what kind of escalation do we want to apply to each of those types of costs? Right? I did a nice simple 50% escalation. You obviously would want to get more specific and get down into what do we think our labor costs are going to be in year 5, probably a different escalator than our material costs and equipment costs, right? You can go in and put in different percentages on each one of those. And even go, like I said in the previous example, we could even take that further, do a dependency and escalate very specific types of costs, right? Maybe we don't want to escalate all of our materials by 50%. We want to escalate just certain types of them by a certain percentage. So let's, now that we've kind of gone through some different examples of our indirects and coming up with those indirects, and as you've seen and hopefully got the gist of, the idea of creating those models so that those variable indirects can adjust, right? Like that last example we saw there for escalation, once we got that model set up, if the project schedule changes and the owner accelerates the project and now it's a 4-year project instead of a 5-year project, those escalation amounts are going to adjust in our estimate automatically. Or worse case, or converse case, it goes longer and now it's a 6-year project. Those indirect costs can be handled. We can add a 6-year in there to cover those costs that have spilled into year 6. But once we've got them all, right, once we've got models in place to account for all of those indirects, one last question is, how do we want to handle those in the estimate, right? How do we want to present them both internally for bid review, estimate review, as well as externally? If we're on the contractor side and we're producing a proposal for the owner to review, how does the owner want to see those indirects? Right, so as we talk about allocating indirect costs, the nice sort of easy way to think of those things is, those we've been focused on the indirects, but profit's really the same way, different ways of coming up with our profit. But, that money, if you will, is just sitting in buckets. And then it's up to us to decide how do we want to sort of pour those buckets out across the line items in the estimate, right? Do we want to allocate those indirects and perhaps your profit as well back into pay items the owner's given us? Do we want to put it in WBS sections? We want to produce a proposal based on maybe CSI divisions or some other WBS. Maybe it's by phase. Another very common one, seem to be getting more common, is just these complex base plus alternate scenarios, right? And those things can wreak havoc with your indirects and profit if you're not careful, right? We've got owner wants to bid on multiple scenarios, right? Different combinations of line items, and we really got to be careful to make sure we've got our indirects covered regardless of which combination the owner ends up choosing. So in terms of approaches, we want to allocate those indirects, typically a few different philosophies, right? We want to do that based on our pricing strategy. If it's a unit price proposal, for example, we may want to get very strategic with how we spread those indirects and profit, right? If we're being paid by the unit, we might want to allocate more of that profit and indirect on items where there's more risk, or items where there's larger quantities, or perhaps items that are occurring early in the job versus later in the job. All kinds of strategies that you can take from a pricing perspective, right? How we allocate those indirects might be based on risk. We want to, like I said, put more profit and overhead in our items where the most risk is. And then lastly, might be based on proposal requirements, right? The owner may have very specific, oftentimes you'll find this on government work, federal work, where, it's very specifically called out, how do we categorize our costs and how do we present that to the owner? So by, again, using a system like InEight Estimate makes it very easy to isolate those indirects and profit, keep those separate, and then depending on those strategies there or requirements, we've got the flexibility to spread those indirects back into the estimate however we want to do that. So Here's a simple example. If we go back to that job management and equipment line item, which was one of the first ones we looked at as an indirect, that money, which is about $230,000 in that one line item, right? We saw before, how did we come up with that line item, which was, various supervision and project managers and things like that. But now the question is, how do we want to allocate that $230,000? Lots of different ways to do that. So we can allocate it back into the different line items in the estimate or different sections of the estimate. We can do that by quantity. We can do it proportionally on a number of ways. It might be proportionally based on cost or man hours or duration, or maybe just by percentage, right? In this simple example here, we said, let's put all of that indirect, let's put 100% of it in our earthwork item here, this excavation. We could have just as easily said, let's put 20% of it in here and 20% of it in another section, 20% in 3 other sections. Right, so this is a nice simple example where we've got complete control. The system gives you complete control over how we want to spread those indirects back into either sections of the estimate or even down to individual line items. And again, that gives us the ability to present the estimate to the owner with those indirects sort of in line with the directs, rather than sort of showing, hey, here's all of our directs, and then in a separate section up above or below covering those indirects. So up to you how you want to control those. Obviously, the key is let's get the money in there and make sure we've got everything covered, and then really up until the last minute even, we can decide how do we want to spread those indirects back into the estimate to facilitate the proposal. So in summary, before we open it up for questions, our goals were really, to create a true cost model for the indirects, just like we want to do for our directs. Right? We want to be able to capture all the assumptions that are going into those indirects in order to deal with changes and the dependencies on those indirects. We want to isolate those indirects from our directs and from our profits, so we've got a better handle on what are we really making as a return for doing the work and taking on the risk. That's our profit, and everything else is a cost, but we want to isolate those indirect costs in order to make sure that we create repeatable, validatable, if that's a word, models that as we collect those as-built in the field, we can validate our assumptions and easily update those indirect models separate from our direct models. In order to do that, we got to capture all the assumptions, right? We need to understand what are the driving factors of our indirects. We saw here some examples of how we can capture those assumptions around durations, around counts and quantities, around timing. All of those things can be captured in a good cost model so that they're easy to change and validate. And then lastly, we want to be able to strategically allocate those indirects, right? So regardless of our pricing strategy or proposal requirements, we've got to have the flexibility to change how we spread those indirects, ideally right up to the last minute, and be able to support our customer demands as well as how we want to see things internally for bid reviews. So with all of that, I will open it up for questions at this point.
Yeah, and we have several. I just want to encourage anybody who still has one. They haven't asked it, go ahead and type it into the question box, and we'll do our best to go through them. So, Brett, I think that your real-world examples really kind of hit home for a few people. So, and then we've got a couple other questions about product functionality specifically. In your real-world experience, Brad, what would you say is the most missed or possibly miscalculated indirect cost most frequently?
That's a tough one because usually just like we saw in that CII study, usually the biggest overall dollar amount is the indirect labor, right? The supervision, the project management. That's where the biggest opportunity to blow it is, right? Because that's the biggest chunk typically of our indirects. Probably the biggest challenge there, and the reason why it's often not accurate that we see is one of two reasons. Number one, that ramp up and ramp down is not taken into account. We might have a project manager that's going to be working for the first month of a 1 year project. Maybe he's working on half time on a new project and half time closing out the old project, and so that that kind of ramp up at the beginning and ramp down at the end is not taken into account. So that like that example we showed, right, in the where you could kind of pinpoint how many do we need, in month 1 versus month 2 versus month 3. Getting that right is probably the biggest challenge, and it, just like any other estimating exercise, it takes experience and thought, right, to think through what is that ramp up and ramp down actually going to look like. Because particularly on a big project, right, if you've got millions of dollars in that number, I mean, even if you're off by by half in month 1 and half in month 2, and you got everything else right, that still can be a significant number. That might be 1 or 2% of the overall project. So that's probably the biggest one. But again, it's going to vary, right, by project by project, and depending on the specs and the job site conditions and everything else. But that labor supervision number is probably the biggest opportunity to make sure you get it right
and not miscalculate. So I have another real world question. So sometimes the subs that we choose have an impact on our indirects because it affects our risk and how much of the work that we choose to do ourselves. How do you suggest handling that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that actually ties back to the first one too. Excuse me. Because there's one that you could easily miss if you're not careful, right? We've all been in situations where we may decide right up at the last minute before the numbers are being finalized, hey, that work we were going to subcontract, let's do that ourselves. Or vice versa, right? We were going to do this work ourselves. Hey, we found a sub that can do it, less cost, less risk, let's sub it out. And as we do that, we may forget to adjust the indirects accordingly, right? If we were planning on doing it ourselves and we had indirects associated with that self-perform work, now we've subbed it out, but we may not have adjusted those indirects, or at least adjusted them accurately. So that's a great example of how a tool like InEight Estimate can, with those models set up, right? If you remember where we set up those indirects that were percentage of different cost types, right? We might have a percentage on top of subs as a cost type for maybe risk or management. Even though they're going to do the work, we're still going to have to manage that work to some degree. So we might have a percentage on top of that. Well, then if that work gets switched over to self-perform, then if we've got the model set up in an InEight Estimate, it'll handle that automatically. As opposed to going back into a spreadsheet trying to remember how did we calculate that number. So those subcontractor models, should we do it ourselves? Should we sub it out? Should we switch from one sub to another? All of those things change the risk profile of the job, might even change the schedule of the job. And as we saw in our examples, if we set up those models to account for those dependencies, then we can feel safe that our indirects are being adjusted accordingly as we make those decisions.
And we have another real world question. So we had talked about this being a skills booster webinar for estimators. And so the question is actually do you have a complete list of the different types of indirects you've seen for the myriad different types of projects?
We are really focused on, obviously the technology side of it. There's a ton of people here at InEight that have been estimators, and we certainly have probably seen everything or just about everything that falls into the indirect category. But I would probably point to CII as probably a great resource for that type of information. CII, Construction Industry Institute, does a lot of surveys, a lot of knowledge articles that have that kind of content, right? So that's a great resource for looking at, we showed that one screen that had, probably a dozen most popular indirects, but certainly there's way more than that. CII would be a great resource to see that kind of stuff.
And if there's another listener with a specific go-to tool that they use, you're welcome to send that to me in the question window, and I can also share it with the group. So I think CII is a great resource to start with. There are a couple of questions, Brad, around product functionality. So going back to the topic of risks, I'm probably better off reading this question. I assume that will be done outside of InEight estimating. If so, is there a plan to develop a risk module that can be integrated with the InEight estimate tool?
Yeah, good question. We are actually developing a risk register as we've expanded the portfolio beyond estimating. That need for capturing those risks is even bigger. It's certainly a factor in during the bidding stage and estimating stage, and it continues to be a factor during execution, right? As risks come along, and how are we going to mitigate them? How do we assign them? Who's going to take steps to deal with the risks? Do we need to add contingencies into the budget or forecast to deal with them? All that kind of stuff is being developed right now as part of our risk register. So that is in flight. In terms of quantifying the risk, certainly there's some things you can do inside of the tool to, you can categorize different line items in the estimate against different risk profiles, and then turn those into costs. Right? So you might add a certain adder. You might maybe add 5% for all of your medium risk items, and then maybe add 10%, whatever it is, on top of your high risk items, something like that. Right? So those kind of categorizations and quantifications can be done inside the estimate tool. We have not and probably will not do any sort of Monte Carlo type simulations to arrive at kind of a risk quantified number. So there are tools out there that do that really well. We can link to those, right? So I've seen a number of customers that will link to risk assessment tools, Monte Carlo and otherwise, where you do the categorization inside the estimate tool, bounce that out to the risk simulator, and then bring the results back into the estimate. So that's one way to go on that. So short answer, we can definitely categorize our line items in the estimate into different risk buckets, and then apply dollar values to those based on those risk categorizations. And then in the future, like I said, we are pulling into the portfolio a full risk register that will cut across the whole, really all the life cycle of the project, right? From even starting back into the design stage all the way through estimate, execution, and turnover. So look for that coming down the road.
So we will stay tuned. The other one is a mix. The asker obviously deals in multiple currencies. So the question is around an exchange rate. Is it fair to assume that InEight does not have a live update of exchange rates? Within my company, we work across multiple currencies, and I'd like to understand how you handle the currency changes every day. And is there a way to live update the system to perform analysis of the difference and account for currency changes between the time of the estimate and the date of the actual payment?
Yeah, that's a really good one. That's something we've grappled with over the years. We certainly have a lot of international customers that work in multiple currencies, particularly as you get into outside the U.S. More common to work in multiple currencies on a single project. So we have built in pretty granular level multi-currency capability into the estimating tool, where you can mix and match currencies in the same estimate. So you might be maybe buying some steel and you want to list that in, let's say, Chinese currency, or maybe the project's being done in Western Europe, so we're gonna account for the labor in euros, but maybe we're also buying some equipment from the U.S. We want to account for that in U.S. dollars. So rather than converting those things as we get the numbers and putting the converted number into the estimate, you can put them into the estimate in their base currency, their native currency. Right. So as you're looking at the estimate, you might see, oh, this is in yen, this is in euros, this is in U.S. dollars, and then manage those currency exchange rates. So if somebody then wants to say, well, what does it look like in all U.S. dollars? Just flip the switch and it'll convert everything into U.S. dollars or euros or yen or whatever currencies you want to look at. So that capability is there, where you can, particularly from a estimating perspective, that's generally what we hear the need is. And usually in pre-construction, we don't want the numbers changing all the time, right? So there's a certain assumptions around kind of the data date that we want to sort of lock in from a currency conversion perspective. So we don't necessarily want it changing on us every day. We do get requests, once the project's into execution, to be able to, deal with the exchange rates and look at that gap between, hey, maybe something we thought was going to be $1 million ended up costing us $1.5 million. Why was that? Was it because we got overcharged? Was it because the currency conversion rate was different from the time we planned it to the time we paid for it? So that last bit, in terms of being able to isolate the variance based on the exchange rate at the time of payment versus the time of the estimate or the budget, is something we are currently working on in our control product, our product that manages budgets and forecasts. So that's coming pretty soon. That'll give you a really nice ability to understand, how much currency risk is there in the project and how much of the variance we're seeing to date, how much of that came from exchange rate fluctuation.
I think that's an interesting topic in general, as companies do more work in multiple currencies. We have one last question, about time for that. I saw how the allocation works. We do a lot of unit price contracts. Does the software have a bid closing capability?
Yeah, it sure does, and that's one of the things that going back to hard dollar, that hard dollar was really known for, and I think is still a strength of the system compared to the other estimating systems that are out there. And part of that is the legacy of the tool goes back, like I said, into that heavy highway, heavy civil kind of world where most of those projects were, and to some degree still are, unit price, where the owner's given us pay items, and so it's up to us on how we spread those indirects and profit. And even spread directs, right? We can move, the tool gives you the ability to move those directs, indirects, and profit around into the different owner pay items, again, based on your pricing strategy, right? Lots of different ways to approach that. Like I said, in terms of supporting a particular pricing strategy, whether that's cash flow driven, whether that is profit driven, whether it's driven on making sure we might have different strategies depending on, maybe it's the first project of many in that same area, so we want to make sure we get the first one. All kinds of different pricing strategies that can be applied, and so the tool gives you the ability to separate. One of the things that our estimating tool does that is unique out there is that we have a separate pay item list from the estimate. So you can work up all your directs, your indirects, your profit, however you want to structure the estimate, by phase, by discipline, by work type, whatever makes sense. And then imagine a separate list of the owner's pay items, and that's what the owner wants to see, right? So when you're ready to close out the bid, we do have a full bid closeout capability where you can spread all those costs and profit and indirects back into the pay items for proposal purposes.
I think that was a really good mix of questions from a real-world perspective and deeper functionality. So, Brett, I want to thank you. For those of you who tuned in, this was either an excellent refresher on indirect costs, or for some, a detailed lesson in indirect costs. So we do this once a month, and we look forward to having you again for another topic in estimating to boost your skills or help you become a better leader of your estimating team. Look forward to talking with you next month, and this concludes Accurately Estimating Indirect and Overhead Costs. Thank you so much, Brett.